my first name.
You're doing fine. Well, welcome everyone to the Ignatius Press live event here. I'm Mark Brumley, and today's guest is the Ignatius Press author Fiorella De Maria, author of See No Evil, a Father Gabriel Mystery. See, we've got props, so I'm going to hold this up.
Great.
I'm going to tell folks a little bit about you, Fiorella. You are an Anglo-Maltese writer living in Surrey, England.
Yes.
With your husband and your children. You grew up in West Country, excuse me, I should say West County, and I'm from St. Louis. We had West County, so you're from West Country. You studied English literature at a small school in England called Cambridge.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And you are the winner of the National Book Prize of Malta, and you've got a ton of novels with Ignatius Press. I'm going to rattle off some of the titles. By the way, I don't have them all here, and this is an indication of how much I love your work. I don't have them all here. I try to keep as many Ignatius Press books here in my home office as possible because I need them in the course of work, right? So I go pull them off as I did here. But your books, I love them so much, I give them away. And then I find like, oh, I don't have that book here. So I'm going to mention some. I won't have them all. I may show some in due course here. So Most Dangerous Innocence, Will Never Tell Them, Do No Harm, and my favorite, Poor Banished Children. Well, maybe we'll talk about why that's my favorite.
Okay.
I know that's the first one we did, and it's a little bit like, since you're in England, I'll use a Doctor Who analogy. It's usually like the first doctor you see is your doctor. And it's kind of the first of your books I read is sort of my entree into your world. So I love it. Anyway.
Gosh, it was a dark entrance though, wasn't it?
It was. Well, let's put it this way. Although the subject matter of the Father Gabriel Mysteries is dark in its own way, the treatment of it is very different than the treatment of dark material in Poor Banished Children.
Yeah.
But we're here to talk about your latest Father Gabriel Mystery, so See No Evil, and we've done two others. We've done The Vanishing Woman and The Sleeping Witness. So I put them out there. And I have to say at the outset, you bear an uncanny resemblance to the author of one of our other Ignatius Press books, okay? And that's a book, which I have around here somewhere. It's called The Abolition of Woman.
Funny that, isn't it? It's just my twin, yeah.
I have never seen the two of you together in a room. So that makes me wonder, but you look exactly like Fiorella Nash. I'm amazed.
Yeah, I keep my bioethics and my creative writing separate.
There you go. Well, okay.
It's easier that way.
So let's talk about See No Evil, a Father Gabriel Mystery. Father Gabriel is obviously he's a clerical detective of sorts, and in a line of clerical detectives, we have Father Brown. Yeah. Father Dahl, they're probably, I think there are, some 300 or so clerical or religious detectives in fiction, but the ones we're probably most familiar with are Father Brown by Chesterton and Father Dowling by the late, great Ralph McInerney. Yeah. And now we have Father Gabriel. So tell us a little bit about Father Gabriel before we kind of get into the particulars of this novel.
Well, you asked me before if he was based on a real priest. I'd just like to say I can't possibly answer that, or there'll be people who'll never speak to me again. He's actually slightly based on my son, in fact, who is autistic. And Father Gabriel is supposed to be a little bit on the spectrum, which is why he gets very obsessive. When he comes up with an idea, he can't let it go, why he finds rules very difficult to obey, not because there's any malice intended, but because once he's got his head fixed on an idea, nothing, even the abbot, will get in the way of him finding out. That's why he sometimes has disastrous social interactions where he brings about a huge silence in a room because he said the wrong thing. So it's an affectionate look at Asperger's, really, of autism. So that's a little bit his background. I love Father Gabriel. Actually, he's one of my favorite creations. I feel because it's a series, I feel like I've had the chance to really get to know him. Normally you get to the end of the book, you close the door on the book, and that's the end of that creative world. But the great thing with the series is, you can really develop the characters and sort of get close to them.
Okay, well, let me ask you this about this particular set of books or series of books. Why you're an established writer, or prize winner, and all of that. Why do you choose to write in the mystery novel genre, and why do you choose to have a priest as your central character?
Well, my dirty little secret is I love crime fiction. I really, really love detective fiction. I've read it all my life. I scared myself half to death, age 7, reading my first Sherlock Holmes mystery. I didn't even realize it was the most frightening of the Sherlock Holmes mysteries, The Speckled Band. The snake comes down on someone's pillow. I did not sleep well after reading that. But I've just always been interested in the puzzle and the human drama and that whole package. And of course, I suppose in Britain, we've got Agatha Christie and Conan Doyle, a huge long heritage of sort of crime novels. So it was an accident waiting to happen. I was always going to write a crime story sooner or later. And one Easter, in fact, I was just with my in-laws and we plotted out the idea amongst us. My mother-in-law came up with some suggestions, and my sister-in-law came up with others, and we've all sat and watched Agatha Christie's together. So it sort of started there and just developed.
Well, that's fascinating. Hans Urs von Balthasar, the great Catholic Swiss theologian, famously loved Agatha Christie novels. Mm-hmm. And I heard a story last summer at a Balthasar conference. The priest invited him over to England, and Balthasar stayed with him for a number of days, and he usually would work in the afternoon and then take a nap, and but then he found out that at this time, this was back in the 80s, I guess mid 80s, the BBC Miss Marple series was on. And so, he would come down and the priest would ask him, are you going to work? You're going to take a nap? He said, no. Can we watch Miss Marple? So Hans Urs von Balthasar loved to read Agatha Christie, but he also loved to watch her in the Miss Marple series.
Yeah, we all grew up with those, with the Miss Marple and the Poirot, the beautiful David Suchet productions, and the huge backdrop to life, really.
So why a priest?
I liked the idea of a figure who was interested in the truth and in justice, but who was also interested in the person and the human soul. And with Father Gabriel, you have that constant conflict that he has, that on the one hand, he wants to find a killer. He wants to clear the name of the person who's been falsely accused, but he's intensely concerned with the soul of the person, the killer, what's going to happen to them, the fact that they're going to probably hang, are they going to die an unprovided for death? There's a much deeper sort of spiritual element to a priest detective, because it's not just a question of solving that puzzle. It's also a question of redeeming, the person, saving the person.
So I'm trying to think about how to talk about this without spoilers.
It's really difficult.
Because I hear in everything you're saying, I know what happens in the story, and I know the particulars of where those ideas are exemplified and all of that. Let me do this. Can you give us a setup for this mystery? Just give us kind of the basic setup, when and where and who and how. We won't spoil the outcome. We won't say who done it, but give us a setup.
I'll try and do this. You'll have to go back afterwards and bleep or something if I accidentally say something. I live in fear of giving away the endings.
We'll just say the butler did not do it.
The butler didn't do it, no. All this series is set just after the war. So it's about 1947, that sort of time. So you've got huge social change going on, a country trying to recover from a major war, soldiers coming home, trying to get back to civilian life, a lot of grief, a lot of war dead, a lot of refugees trying to start a new life, people with histories that they're trying to escape from or trying to reinvent themselves. And this particular book is the classic country house mystery. It's Christmas time, a whole lot of people gathered together for a dinner party. The next morning, someone's dead in the mist. and he witnessed a massacre. That's the thing that it looks as if was the motivating factor. He was about to write a book to reveal something, so someone had a reason to want him dead. But of course, in the course of the book, Father Gabriel starts to discover that there are all sorts of other dirty little secrets lurking around this group of people. Very few of them are really innocent. So there are multiple strands.
Okay, so all right. So now let me ask this question. Chesterton in Father Brown is very philosophical as a fiction writer.
Yeah.
Not just in Father Brown, but in Man Who Was Thursday, Ball on the Cross, Man Alive, Flying In, all these novels, they have characters. The characters are actually very lively characters, but in some ways, the characters are ciphers for philosophical ideas and so on. Mm. Reading your book, and there's an argument for that kind of writing and those kinds of mysteries and Father Brown mysteries and so on. In a lot of ways, they say that Father Brown, Sherlock Holmes looks for external clues. Father Brown looks for interior ones, or something like that.
Yeah.
Your mystery writing isn't Chestertonian in that sense, but there are ideas at play. How do you, as a writer, find the balance between telling a story and developing characters in their own right and conveying ideas without completely instrumentalizing your characters in your plot?
Yeah. Well, I think you have to start completely from the basis that you're telling a story. More than anything else, you're a storyteller. You're there to create good characters and interesting plots and tell a story. First and foremost, that is what a novelist is supposed to do. If I want to write theology, I'll go and get a doctorate and write a thesis. If you start from that basis, then the messages, I feel, just come through naturally. I think if you start within the Catholic moral universe in which we all live, and it permeates everything, it permeates the way we live, therefore it permeates how we write. And it shouldn't be necessary to force the messages. They should naturally flow from the action. Okay,
so now you've set up this story, and you've kind of given us your philosophy or approach as a writer. What's the kind of, what do you see as the big motif or the big ideas behind the characters and the plot of this story? Or can you put it that way?
This one, out of all of the three of them, is mostly dealing with collusion with evil and how you can be a small player in a much bigger crime. And this is something that people throughout Europe had to deal with in the years following the war and are still dealing with to some extent. The failure to resist, or those minor acts of collaboration. In this book, the characters are English, they weren't under occupation, and yet many of them have, one way or the other, profited from the evils that the Nazis committed. And in some cases, even the minor characters have got themselves caught up in situations they know were immoral. So the idea that collusion with evil is always wrong, even if it's in a very minor capacity, is a sort of theme that runs all the way through the book. It's also about taking responsibility for one's actions. Father Gabriel has to really push some of the characters to stop making excuses all the way through. You're talking sort of roughly the time of Nuremberg, an awful lot of I was just obeying orders. In a much smaller way, in a West Country town, Father Gabriel is constantly having to push the characters to say, no, you knew that was wrong. Why did you do it? And how will you take the consequences? So it's a lot of it comes down to conscience, and the way the characters try to avoid that.
Well, I have to say, again, I'm not going to give away the ending or anything. I have to say that as I was coming to the ending of the book, and to be honest, this didn't happen the first time when I read it as a manuscript. And sometimes that's the case. You're kind of looking for different things when you read it as a manuscript. But I read it, and I often do this, after we've published a book, I read it as a published book. And when I read it the second time, again, I don't want to sound pietistic and make it sound like this is a you should take this to confession or something. It's a fun read. I mean, it's just a fun read as a mystery novel, right? But as I was approaching the end of the book, and I was thinking about some of the characters and some of the justifications that they gave for the things that they did, I'm thinking, well, that's a pretty weighty excuse. And then what you did with the Father Gabriel character was great, because it didn't deny the weight of those excuses, but it cut straight through to the truth and laid it bare.
Yeah, and in a way, because Father Gabriel does have this sort of spectrum way of looking at things, he's not fooled by anything. He doesn't get deception, and so it's impossible to take him on a ride in that sense. He will always see through everything, and that's one of his strengths, in fact, as a priest, that he can very gently bring a person back and say, well, that doesn't really make sense, does it? Having said that, out of all the three books, it was the ending of See No Evil that's caused the most comment. I've had people say they were very shocked, very, very surprised by the way it was handled. So be interested to know what readers make of it.
Well, now I could say that when I first read it as a manuscript, I was surprised. I don't say I was shocked, but once the character of Father Gabriel kind of goes down a certain trajectory and how he's interacting with the characters, then it's a matter of truth. It has to come out the way it came out in a certain sense. So it wasn't shocking in that way, but the whodunit and how it happened was a surprise to me. Anyway, I was surprised.
Phew. I'm always glad when it's a surprise. I have a horror that it's too predictable, because I know how it ends.
Right. So that brings me to the question that I know mystery writers often are asked. How do you start with the mystery? Do you start with the crime? You know who does it and how it's done, and then you build the story around it, or do you start in some other way where you start with a plot and unfolds and
I think you have to start with the crime and sort of work your way out. And then sort of undo the puzzle. I find, I don't just write crime fiction, as you know, I write literary fiction too. When I'm writing other kinds of novel, I don't make plans. I will sketch out some characters and I'll have a period I want to write about, like the First World War or the slave trade or whatever. And once I've created the main characters, I just let it flow, because I want to be part of the journey. And I want to be as surprised as the reader by how it turns out. But with a crime novel, you can't really do that in the same way, because you have to make sure that the clues are released in a particular order, that you don't give away too much information at the end. It's quite a formulaic genre in a way. There are a lot of rules.
And you have to do it without it coming across too formulaic. It's got to be people engaged in reading.
Yeah. So it's like having to write a cliche and pretend it's not a cliche, because that's what people would say. It's quite a delicate balancing act, but it's a more technical form of writing in a way, because so much of it is focused on the puzzle.
Let me ask you about, I want to come back to this particular book, but I want to ask you about crime writing more generally, in mystery novels and detective stories and so on. There are those stories that set out they keep it a mystery, and the mystery is who did it, who did the crime, and so on. Then there's what I call the Columbo approach. You're familiar with the American detective Columbo?
Now you see the crime being committed, don't you, in Columbo?
You see the crime being committed, you know who did it.
I didn't like that, yes.
You what?
I didn't like that.
You didn't like that.
Yes, you see.
Because there, it's not so much it's not who did it at all. You know who did it. It's how's he going to get caught. And so I'm kind of curious. So you don't like the Columbo way of doing a mystery?
No, it's reasonably unusual, because most crime fiction does leave it as a mystery for the reader to work out. So it's interesting that Columbo, that it's completely different. That yes, the story is really about the detective working it out, and you're watching him working it out. I've always liked a mystery, and I like to be kept guessing. I do find, because I write crime fiction, it's harder to read crime fiction where I can't work it out, because there are in fact only so many plots. there are only so many people who could have done it. I ruined an Agatha Christie for my father once, where the murder had been committed, and you're having the first interviews, and the doctor said, "Oh, you can't speak to her. She died of septicemia." And I went, "It's the doctor," because nobody ever dies a natural death in a murder mystery. So someone must have killed her. So it must have been the doctor. And at the end, sure enough, the doctor says, "Oh, it was me." And my father just looked at me and said, "How did you know?" I said, "Well, because." But he said he spent the whole of the mystery, and it suddenly looks so obvious when someone says it,
So does your husband enjoy watching movies with you? Mystery movies, where you say, "Well, this person did it," and that's the end of it.
Well, he likes to see if I'm right. If I'll say I think it was him, and then and then we'll have a little bet to see at the end. He hates watching period dramas with me because I'm a bit of a pedant because I write historical fiction. If I see an anachronism, I'll start saying, "They never said that in those days," or "He wouldn't have talked to her like that." And it must get very boring to listen to, actually.
You must have quite a challenge today, because that's sort of a contemporary way of doing these period pieces by using modern slang and all of that, which I can live with to a degree, but sometimes it just drives me insane. My wife and I do the same thing. We point out all the things that are anachronistic and all that in these stories. Yeah. Well, so back to this particular story, See No Evil. Again, without divulging too much, we have to say that there appear in this story communists and Nazi-influenced people, very wealthy people, people on the lower socioeconomic ladder. We have religious people, non-religious people, and it's not a novel in which I think you could say that the non-Catholics in the novel do bad things, but it's not as if the Catholics are wholly, and there aren't a whole lot of them in this, other than the priests, but there are a few. That the Catholics are sort of always the paragons of virtue.
I'm sorry, I missed just a little bit of what you said just then. Just the last few words.
The Catholics are not entirely the paragons of virtue in the story.
No, I don't create plaster saints. I think I'm very keen to make it clear that we're all fallen, and we all sin, and I don't like it when characters are very squeaky clean, because I think that's where you start to merge into propaganda. I've read, I was given a novel to read once years ago, it was a Christian novel by an evangelical writer, and it was just like that. The Christian characters were so wonderful, and they were so perfect, and they all had names like Nathan, and they belonged to local Christian rock bands, and they always had the best possible motives for everything. And maybe it's because I'm not called Nathan and I don't belong to a Christian rock band that I didn't get it. But I think that's what can be very off-putting, in fact, sometimes about Christian fiction. We have to be realistic about what we are, but it's a question of the journey, and that Father Gabriel, through his ministry to those, so there are a few Catholic characters in there,
right,
can hopefully reach out to them, and they can repent, and they have the opportunity to put their lives on a better track. It's not a dark story in that sense either. That there's always the hope that people can turn their lives around.
Right, and he's not. He does what you would expect a priest to do, but he's not especially preachy or whatever in his encounter with people. In his encounters, I'm amazed at his persistence with. You can understand why he would be persistently present to one of the Catholic characters in the story, but many other characters are not Catholic, and nevertheless, he's a presence to them. He's a witness to them. Without being preachy. So I just found that interesting, that's the way you made the character. And the temptation, I would think, might be to make the priest character not just simply a super saint, which, he's obviously a good man, but he's got his flaws and he's aware of his flaws. So the temptation would be to make him sort of a super saint, and that all of the encounters would be, sort of these theological discourses and
Yes.
trying to move people to the Catholic Church or something. But you don't do that.
No, I mean, I think I try to make him as realistically of his time as much as a priest of the 1940s, and he does have the gentle touch. Of course, he's a late vocation,
Right.
which
so talk a little bit about that, because I think his background is very fascinating, and that comes through in terms of his own spiritual. I don't say spiritual struggles, but they are his spiritual struggles. If you could talk a little bit about his background, it'd be great.
Yes, he was married. He had a child. He lost his wife and child very tragically, and it was after that he turned to the monastery, looking for peace initially. He's been a priest for about 9-10 years by the time the story starts, but he does have this background, and he has the grief and the sense of guilt because he wasn't able to save them. And you can see that would drive so much of his determination to protect the innocent in his work as an amateur detective. So there's that side of things, but it also means he is very understanding of loss, at a time when many, many people are suffering loss, when pretty much every family would be grieving for somebody. It gives him, in fact, he actually says when he's talking to his friend Alan, he said he feels it gives him a way to get close to people. So there's that aspect to it, but he isn't afraid of being completely honest as well. So when Paul the communist sort of says, could you put in a good word for me? He makes it quite clear he's not going to encourage a Catholic to let his niece marry a communist, right. Which is exactly what he would have said. And so he knows where to draw the lines, and sometimes the characters don't like that because they don't expect it.
Well, and certainly today we've become, for good or ill, much more accommodating to the society. And I don't want to bash priests today or something like that, but as is true of many of us, I've been in situations where you feel as if the Catholic or the Catholic priest should say or do something, and he says nothing or does nothing, because to say something is to become, socially out of line, and of course we can be bores about it too, but
no, I think it saddens me because I think there is always a fear of offending or hurting or whatever, but I always feel if the truth is told firmly but kindly, then it will bear fruit. I infinitely prefer it personally if somebody is honest with me. I find, I would hate to think that somebody was just saying something because they thought it was sort of polite. I mean, the British are very polite, you probably noticed.
Yes.
You practically the
Although
House.
I've seen sessions of Parliament. I don't know how polite they are there, but anyway.
Well, compared with my motherland, they're very polite. They don't throw things at each other.
Oh, well, that's good.
You don't get angry mobs coming outside the Parliament buildings. But yes, I mean, I must apologise for our politicians at the moment.
Oh well, I can apologise for some of ours too, but
we're on the same boat.
Let's not get into that.
But I think that's, and I suppose that's really perhaps the way Father Gabriel behaves like that. It's maybe the way. I'm not saying that I'm setting him up as an example, because he does get it wrong sometimes, but he tells people the truth because he does actually care about them. He doesn't want them to make a mistake.
And he takes his faith seriously. Again, without being a propaganda tool, he takes it seriously, and so he acts the way you would expect someone who takes it seriously would act.
Yeah. I mean, it's like the way a parent ought to act, if you think about it. If you love your children, you'll tell them when you think they're wrong,
That's right. Yeah. Sometimes my children think I tell them that too much, and I probably do. But
oh, my children too. My children too.
So, all right. So, Father Gabriel, See No Evil. People talk about, summer reads. This is a great summer read. Before we got on to this call, I was asked where I would have people start. They could start with this. There'd be no problem, right? You can go here, and the fact that you've had two other Father Gabriel mysteries doesn't mean you can't start with this one, right?
Yeah.
But I like The Vanishing Woman.
Okay.
And it may be a similar thing as with Poor Banished Children. That's the first one I read, so that's the one I got into. But any of these are great summer reads, and you're working on the next one, right?
Yeah, number 4, in which
you
you will
learn a
learn.
little bit of a preview.
Well, you will learn a lot more about his past. It will come back to haunt him. He will be dealing with a murder that looks like a tragic accident.
All right, very good.
Yeah, but he'll be going way back into his past. Yeah.
There's another book project of yours that I think is in production with us right now. You know the one I'm talking about? I don't want to give away too much.
Believe it or not, I have 3 books in production with you at the moment.
So let me think which.
Was it co-authored?
Yes.
Yes, that one. Yes.
Can we give people a little bit of a hint about that, because that's very different from Father Gabriel. It's very, very different from the other novels that you've done. It's a kind of genre I love. But just tell us a little bit about it.
I co-authored this book with my great friend Kevin Turley. It's the first time I've ever co-authored a novel. It's quite unusual to do that because it's a fairly solitary exercise. And it's the horror genre, which is a completely new departure for me. I've never written on this subject before. So think vampires, think the early days of Hollywood, all those creepy films, and that as the backdrop. It's set in the 1950s, looking back. So, yes, very different. And do we know when it's coming out? Am I allowed to ask?
I will not say. And the reason I won't say is if I'm wrong, then I'll get angry emails. Oh. I've been on television or radio before, and somebody was asked about a book that they heard was coming out. And I said, it's going to be out in September or whatever. And then if it's delayed, then I get the email. Well, you said that, this is going to come out. So, but I think people are going to love that book. And, this is really, I think, an important, I'm glad we're talking about this and also talking about mystery novels and Catholic writing, because, the Catholic universe is the whole universe. It is the whole universe. And so we can tell stories using murder mystery genre, sci-fi. Michael O'Brien's done science fiction. Other people have done science fiction who are, Catholic writers, and now horror. So I think it's exciting. Yeah. Okay, who are your favorite writers?
Oh gosh, I've got a list a mile long. Well, I've been hugely influenced by all the classics: Dickens, Jane Austen, George Eliot. I find I go through phases. When I was a teenager, I had a huge Thomas Hardy phase.
Okay.
I now absolutely cannot stand Thomas Hardy. I can't bear going anywhere near Tess of the D'Urbervilles. But I went to school right in that area where Thomas Hardy was writing. He was a West Country writer. Whereas I didn't like Dickens as a teenager, and I've rediscovered Dickens more recently. So
why didn't you like Dickens as a teenager?
I made the mistake with Dickens, and I've tried not to make this mistake with my children. I started reading Dickens far too young. When I was really very young, and even though I was old enough and could read well enough to read the stories, I wasn't mature enough to really understand the social commentary and all the many, many layers of subtext. So I found bits of it silly, the names and things like that. And I couldn't quite get sort of under the skin of it. Whereas reading it from the point of view of maturity, I'm just loving rediscovering all those novels again.
Excellent. Well, okay, so we're in the 19th century. What about the 20th?
Pretty eclectic. I mean, I've read a lot of sort of contemporary novelists like Salman Rushdie, for example. I never got on with magical realism, but I was always, when I first started writing, I read a lot of non-European authors because I was trying to find a voice, and I felt with my Maltese background, I needed to look elsewhere to try to make that come to life. And and I love the fact that with Rushdie's early books, he used the oral tradition a lot in his books, which fits a lot more with my own sort of storytelling background. So sort of Midnight's Children, books like that were very influential for me. But I found a lot of contemporary writers, because they're so secular, in many cases very anti-religious. I also chafed against that. I took a lot from the writing style, but felt I wanted to move away from that. I tell you, a priest said to me that he felt the problem with modern writing is that it tells us a lot about the human mind, but it tells us nothing about the soul.
Oh, wow. That's a powerful statement.
Very interesting. So Father Stephen Wang, I remember I was at a reception when he said it. And I remember thinking that is just absolutely correct. And with my own writing, I want to be able to write about the soul.
Well, that's very powerful. So you've mentioned some writers. I sort of did an awkward transition from the various genres of Catholic writing that are emerging today to the question of writers. But what genre do you like reading? What fictional genres do you like reading?
I do like historical novels. I suppose because I write them. Well, I do read a lot of crime fiction, I have to admit, but I do try and read some slightly more serious stuff as well.
Mm-hmm.
I love historical novels when they're well written. I just find them an absolute joy. I do find that the anachronistic attitudes in a lot of historical novels are very jarring, but when it all comes together perfectly, it's really beautiful. It really works. So yes, anything particularly things looking at the early 20th century, late 19th century, I find that period very interesting.
Have you read any Tim Powers?
No, and I feel as if I should have done.
So he's an American sort of fantasy writer, and he does a lot of historical stuff. And he always makes it so that the main historical character in the novel, what transpires in the novel has to be plausible based upon that historical personage's real life and real chronology. So you can't have, we know that in 1943 the character was, in France, but this novel is going to set him, in Portugal or something like that. So he takes that seriously, but then he brings in all kinds of supernatural elements to the story. I find him fascinating because I like that fantasy type stuff, but I also like historical fiction. I like learning history. Not that I don't know the difference between fiction and history, but I like learning history as I'm reading novels. I think it's fun.
Well, I think with a really well researched historical novel, it can bring a period to life in such a beautiful way. I mean, I loved, for example, Lucy Beckett's book Leaves Are Falling, because I actually felt as if I was there, and I found myself thinking that the Katyn massacre might not happen. Because it's so vividly drawn. You actually, even though you know how it has to end, she writes it without a hint of what's coming. And a book like that, you can just read it and just lose yourself in the period.
Well, absolutely, and I feel that way about this, Most Dangerous Innocence.
Do I think that was my favorite book to write.
Really? Why?
I liked the idea of the boarding school scenario. I went to boarding school myself. I'm not going to say if it's in any way resembling.
Well, let's learn a lot about you here.
Yes. Well, a nun from my old school wrote a rather sneering review of Abolition of Woman, and I suggested I send her A Most Dangerous Innocence, and I said that the fact that well, actually, I won't give away the ending. Might give the wrong impression about my education, but I thought the scenario was kind of. I suppose I wanted to bring a comedy element into a very serious subject, and because it is seen through the eyes of an autistic maths whiz in a boarding school who's bored out of her mind and really a bit too old for that kind of environment, so sniffing around for trouble, it's going to end badly. But with all that sort of quirkiness of that sort of uniquely British microcosm of a society, there's something about a boarding school. I mean, I found when we were in the editing stage, there were so many moments where the editors would come back to me and say, "What on earth is a tuck shop?" Why is he throwing a rubber across the room, and what's that about? Oh no! I found out what that word means in American English, which it does not mean in Britain.
That's right.
Yeah, I tried to think what sort of person they thought he was. But But I realised that there's a whole language, there's a whole vocabulary connected up that even some British people wouldn't get, because it is almost like its own little society. So I found the idea of just recreating that and trying to do the thing of describing the war at a time when nobody knew how it was going to end. Because a lot of stories set during the war, they presuppose that everything's going to be fine and we're going to win. But of course, in 1940, nobody knew that. And it was a challenge of creating, a situation where they're really worried there's going to be an invasion. There's all sorts of fears, without anticipating the ending.
Well, yeah, you do a good job. You bring the reader in, and I, as a reader, got as excited in reading it as you are excited in describing it, and also that sense of, yes, even though I know how everything comes out and what happens, how we get in the war, and all of that, that sense of being there in the moment, you did a good job of conveying that. And that's really what I need when I read a historical novel. I don't want to read it from the perspective of, I know how all this comes out. I want to read it as if I can put myself in the mindset of the character, and the story is unfolding for me as it's unfolding for that character.
Yeah, exactly. That was the plan. So I'm glad you enjoyed it. But, that was
my wife and I, we just watched again the movie yesterday, the Beatles movie. I don't know if you've seen that film.
I haven't. Is it good?
Well, you should see that, because it's a lot of fun, but it's also kind of a fantasy storyline where this character winds up in an accident. He wakes up in a world where nobody knows the Beatles, right? He's a musician.
Oh, yes, I have heard about this.
So he passes off the Beatles music as his own music. And one of the things we were fascinated with is the experience, because we were little kids, very, very little, of course, when the Beatles were first around.
Oh, very little, yeah.
Yeah, it's very tiny, hardly in existence. When my wife and I, when we first heard the Beatles, so we had a kid's perspective on this music, and so you're thinking, well, what would it be like to hear this for the first time without a context, and so on, and that made me think, of your book and what you just said, Most Dangerous Innocence. You kind of have that experience of living through the eyes of these characters, seeing these events through the perspective of these characters, and there is that kind of contingency of history in the lives of these characters that good historical fiction creates for the reader. So appreciate that.
Thank you. Oh, I'm glad you enjoyed it.
Well, Fiorella, we're going to have you back. I'd love to have more conversations with you, not just about your books, or not just about your fiction, but about your book, The Abolition of Woman, and some of the biotechnological issues that we face. That's a whole nother subject.
Yeah.
But it would be great to have you back, and so we'll try to schedule a time in which we can do that. Thank you for writing these wonderful novels and telling these wonderful stories, and please keep at it.
Thank you.
Well, God bless you.
Fun. God bless.
Bye-bye.